All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to talk about what happens when a global trade threat suddenly gets really personal. You see, a new wave of American tariffs didn't just cause a political ripple in India. Nope, it kicked off a massive nationwide movement. So, let's get right into it.
So what are we really looking at here? Is this just another trade war? The usual back and forth with taxes and penalties? Or is it something way bigger? Something like a whole country deciding to look inward to figure out its own economic future? That's the big question we're tackling.
Okay, so at its heart, this whole thing really comes down to a standoff, a new trade standoff between two major world leaders and their, let's say, very different approaches to the economy.
And here's the core conflict, boiled down. On one side, you have the United States taking action externally, right? They're imposing tariffs on foreign goods. But India's response, it was the total opposite. It was all about looking inward, promoting stuff made right there at home.
All right, let's start with what kicked this whole thing off. We've got to talk about the U.S. tariff threat.
And the number was a big one, 25%. The White House dropped this, and it wasn't just aimed at one country. We're talking about a new tariff on exports from India and around 70 other nations. You can imagine that sent a huge shockwave through, well, pretty much all of global trade.
And it wasn't just the policy. The language got incredibly sharp. On social media, then President Trump went as far as to call India a dead economy. I mean, you can imagine that just poured fuel on the fire and really heated up the whole debate.
And to make things even more intense, there was a deadline, a hard deadline. The tariffs, plus some kind of extra penalty that wasn't even specified, were all set to go into effect on August 7th. So, yeah, the clock was ticking. So, the big question is, how did India respond? With all this pressure, they could have just fought fire with fire, right? Slap on their own tariffs. But they didn't. Instead, they took a totally different approach, a pivot inward. This is India's Swadeshi response. And this response came straight from the very top. Prime Minister Narendra Modi was speaking to a big crowd in his constituency, Varanasi, and he didn't just get up there and talk about policy details. No, he called for a whole new national mindset.
The key word he used was Swadeshi. So, what exactly is Swadeshi? Well, it's a really powerful idea in India, with roots that go all the way back to the independence movement. It's all about economic self-sufficiency. The idea of promoting and using goods that are made right there, inside your own country.
But why push this idea so hard right now? Well, the Prime Minister's rationale was pretty straightforward. He pointed out that the global economy is unstable, uncertain. And when that happens, countries start looking out for number one. They focus on their own interests. So his point was, India has to be sharp about its own economic priorities, especially if it wants to hit that massive goal of becoming the world's third largest economy.
So this whole philosophy got packaged into a really catchy phrase, vocal for local. But okay, what does that actually mean? Like for a regular person or a small business owner on the street?
This is where it gets really interesting, because an economic policy turned into a powerful emotional message. The Prime Minister put it in a way that was super personal, almost patriotic. He said, if it has been made by the sweat of our people, with their skills, that product is Swadeshi for us. And just like that, buying something wasn't just a transaction anymore. It became about connecting with your fellow citizens.
Okay, so how do you actually do this? The PM's speech had a whole list of points, but we can boil it down to 3 simple steps for any citizen. Number 1, before you buy something, just ask, hey, is this made in India? 2, actively talk to shopkeepers. Urge them to stock and sell more local stuff. And 3, with big festivals and wedding season on the horizon, really make a conscious effort to buy Indian for those big celebrations. Simple, right? And this wasn't just a message for consumers. Nope. The Prime Minister made a special, direct appeal to the people who are the backbone of retail in the country, the traders and shopkeepers. He basically asked them to take a pledge to sell only Swadeshi goods. All right, so we've got the U.S. threat on one side and the Indian response on the other. But to really understand what's at stake here, we need to zoom out. We need to look at the bigger picture. So what do the experts say? Well, according to them, these tariffs, they weren't really the main event. They were a classic pressure tactic, just a strategic move, plain and simple.
The goal? To push India into a trade deal, but on America's terms.
And if you look at the proposed trade deal, the sticking points become really clear. The U.S. wanted India to lower its duties on American exports, but India was holding firm, especially on really sensitive stuff like agriculture, dairy, and GM foods. They were basically saying, no way, we have to protect our own farmers and producers.
And you have to remember the context here because it's so important. The U.S. wasn't coming to this negotiation empty-handed. They were on a winning streak. They had just locked in favorable trade deals with Japan, the UK, and the EU. That kind of track record, it absolutely ramped up the pressure on India to give in.
And that really brings us to the final big question here. This whole standoff, a global tariff strategy clashing with a national movement for self-sufficiency. It poses a massive question for the future of the entire global economy. As more and more trade barriers go up around the world, is looking inward the only way for a country to move forward and prosper? There's definitely no easy answer to that one. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.